we've called this episode the end of the United Nations ? But it seems that it's really the broader sort of system of global governance, which of course is symbolized by the UN, and that we've had over the last decades, that you think is failing. Let's start by you telling us how you think the system is failing us today.
Absolutely. And, coming into this conversation, I saw your screen that said the end is beginning soon. And I certainly think that the coronavirus pandemic that we are still in the middle of has heralded. It's been a kind of clarion call for the beginning of the end of the United Nations. If you are worried about what I'm saying, I'm certainly saying that this is the United Nations as it was created in the post-World War situation of 1945. A little bit of history. This is not the first time the end of a global body like this has been contemplated, or has a new one has been thought about. People perhaps don't make the connection, but in the 1830s, 1840s, Lord Tennyson wrote Locksley Hall, which was famous because he spoke, even though he was talking about a man who had, had lost his love and all the rest of that, begins to contemplate on the future of the world and actually says, this is a time for a parliament of man, a federation of the world. Why is that important? Because there was a certain look at colonialism. We'd already had the Vienna Congress in 1815, looking at what are the ways of global governance. It can't just be the hegemony of a few, or it certainly should not be just about each man for himself, but a larger idea. 100 years later, in fact, when the discussions over the United Nations happened, US President Harry Truman used to carry Locksley Hall in his wallet as he went into negotiations. There was the League of Nations in between that was begun in 1920 and then folded up less than 2 decades later. So let's be clear, the new world order that is discussed, it has been discussed in the past. And every time we have come up with a similar kind of idea, even if it hasn't been practiced in quite the same way. And the new world order, as the United Nations today represents it, came out of the World War. It came out of World War II. It wasn't a futuristic thing. It wasn't looking to the future in any way. It was based on a previous victory, or a victory that had just been undertaken. As a result, the UN Security Council, the governing body of, or the security body of the global governance body, actually just contained victors, or those who were defined as victors. So some in the world might say, well, how was France a victor? But there it is in the UN Security Council, the US, UK, France, Russia, China, many questions about that given its own membership. But they not only won permanent seats on the UN Security Council, they won a veto, which has ensured, if you ask me, that the beginning of the end of the UN as it came out of World War II actually began with that idea of the veto. Why do I say that? And why do I say this now? To begin with, and I'll give you 5 quick reasons and then and we can take this forward. One, because the balance of power, this veto that gave the Security Council members so much power, the permanent members, has actually led to an impasse today. We see it on issue after issue where the UN Security Council itself is divided, and as a result, the UN's decision-making is fairly divided. There are fewer subjects people can agree on. And I think this has been typified by what happened with the coronavirus pandemic. Instead of being the first movers, the UN bodies were in fact seen as fumbling and coming very short. There was intense politicization between the US and China over it. And we'll come into the roles of both those countries during this. But what has happened is that the delay has cost the entire world. So the delay in mobilization of the United Nations. Second, because as a result of that US-China conflict, we are entering a new Cold War whose principles themselves are less interested in multilateralism. Let's be clear, when the pandemic began in China, its first instinct was not a global instinct. It was not to warn the world about what was going to come. It was about protecting itself. We've seen China also blatantly reject when it needs things like United Nations decisions, tribunals. The UNCLOS verdict is just an example that it was a signatory to. On the other hand, too, the US is shying away from multilateralism more than ever. And if you look at the walkouts of the UN, whether it's the UNHRC, UNESCO, the Paris Agreement, and then WHO itself, defunding WHO and then quitting. The third reason, because the UN governance structure as it is, just doesn't represent the world that it seeks to represent. 5 members, of which 3, if you count Russia, belong to the European continent. There is no representation at the highest body level of Africa or South America, and certainly just one country from China, from Asia, which is China. And Asia as a continent represents 60% of the world population. So I'm talking about the top, but I'm just saying that the way it's represented, there is a problem there. Fourth, because the old governance system just doesn't address the future of the world, particularly the post-corona world that we are going to see, whether it is on cyberspace and artificial intelligence, whether it is on the future of work, bio-warfare of an order that could be much, much, much more diabolical than what we have seen from corona, mass migration for a world on the move, peacekeeping, and at the same time, because the old global governance system has not been able to stop that, which it was created in a sense to oppose: authoritarianism, majoritarianism, the crushing of dissent and the mistreatment of minorities worldwide. So that's where the UN is. And finally, the UN itself has become, as a structure, it has become unwieldy, spreading itself too thin, taking on causes it cannot enforce. And how long it takes, it's in the 75th year, the United Nations. Think of in the last few weeks how long it took for the declaration of the United Nations on its 75th year just to put together because of differences between the members. And I'll leave you with this thought. The UN Security Secretary General was asked a few years ago what kept him up at night, which crisis in the world kept him up at night. He didn't say any of the expected, conflict, biowarfare, cyber warfare, and everything else. He said fragmented structures within the UN, Byzantine procedures, endless red tape. So is reforming the UN quite the answer? A whole new world order? Either way, I think the present as we see it is walking itself into an era of irrelevance.
Thank you so much. I think this is a great sort of overview of the issue at hand. And I really like what you said, that sort of the end of the United Nations as we know it essentially started 75 years ago. That was sort of in the structure, in sort of choosing these victorious powers, that sort of, it was clear from the beginning, if you want, that at some point this would lead to the impasse that we're seeing right now. I do want to talk briefly about the role of sort of the world's 2 largest powers in this. You've mentioned both of them, of course, the United States and China. And so not only do these 2 countries have a conflict going on right now that is getting more intense by the day, they also, as you've mentioned, they both have their qualms with the UN system, with global governance. They're not, maybe in a way committed to the system as they should be. Yet they are taking somewhat different approaches and strategies. The US seems to be mostly retreating from the system, going out of organizations, stopping to contribute, whereas China is trying to actually gain influence. So could you talk to us a little bit how you see those 2 strategies unfolding and why you think those 2 countries actually have picked those 2 different strategies? They seem remarkably, for 2 countries that seem to not want to engage more with this global system, they seem to have chosen 2 somewhat different approaches, don't they?
Absolutely, and this is the irony, because if the United Nations is to represent democracies, it is strange that what we are in right now is the retrenchment of the world power that is a democracy, i.e. the United States, and the rise in this global governance system of China, which is not a democracy. So what we're seeing is essentially 2 global powers, neither of which represents the ideal. In terms of just where they are today in supporting this global governance structure, both of whom are looking at it in a much more transactional, much more opportunistic, if I may say so, way of what the global governance system can do for them, how it can be a force multiplier for them. The coronavirus pandemic is an example. Neither of these world powers have come off looking like they led the world out of the coronavirus pandemic. China, as I said, did not announce this pandemic early enough, did not prepare the world, or even once the world knew what was coming, help it in quite the same way. The US, by example, has not been an extremely good role model for how a global power should deal with a healthcare crisis like this. So we're looking at these two major powers, or the global powers, if you like. And I think the rise of China, the retrenchment of the United States is also leading to a third phenomenon, which is the success and rise of individualistic, populist, even protectionist leaders. Why do I say the US is in retrenchment and China is rising? Very quickly, the US is disengaging from world problems. We're looking at it very purposefully pulling its military out of areas where it was seen originally going in as a peacekeeping or democracy building force, whether it's Iraq, Syria, or now Afghanistan. It's pulling out from world organizations. A former UN ambassador from India actually listed 12 organizations and agreements that the US had signed on to that it has walked out of just in the last 2 or 3 years. The third disengagement is from the US's own allies, from its coalitions that it built around the world, whether it's NATO pulling troops out of Germany, South Korea and Japan being told much more to manage their own problems. No one is saying that the US has to be the policeman of the world. But if it doesn't want to, then by definition, it is creating the space, and the space is being used by other countries, most notably by China. And China is using it militarily in terms of connectivity, the Belt and Road Initiative we've seen, telecommunication, where it's trying to spread its network wide. The problem, again, is not that China is offering these to the world, but the conditions that are attached to it are essentially linked to the prosperity of China. It's not transparently about the good of the world. And then finally, as I said, there is this idea that this is leading to a vacuum, in a sense, in the rest of the world, where we are seeing the rise of anti-elitist, anti-pluralistic phenomenon called populism, which has also become xenophobic, anti-migration, economically protectionist, anti-globalization. And back to the coronavirus, and big reactions to it has been this move towards anti-globalization. So I could speak much longer about each of these issues, but anybody in any part of the world is now confronting these three factors.
Mm. So you make a very compelling case, and it'd be hard to deny that all the problems that you have mentioned with the United Nations and sort of the broader system of global governance exist. However, there's an argument to be made that the system has been remarkably successful over the last 75 years, just showcased by the fact that it's still here, and it has survived crises like the Cold War, like many others. It has its shortcomings, but what makes you so sure that it's just not going to continue muddling through? So that what makes you sure that it's not going to survive the current crisis without fundamental reform, or even without even being replaced, just sort of because it's there and because it's easier to keep what we have than to come up with something new?
Well, simply because, as they say, the center cannot hold. Eventually what is happening is, if the UN is increasingly irrelevant to the big problems in the world, whether it's these crises that I just mentioned, or whether it is actually doing what it is meant to do, which is to prevent another world war in that sense, or to prevent another large conflict in which the world has to be ranged on one side or the other. If it is unable to do that, then there is going to be a search for something else. Hopefully the search will come before we reach that point of break or thing. Look, I'll be honest, even personally, I began my career at the United Nations. I've watched outside as a journalist, the UN Security Council take on real problems around the world and come to the rescue of people who had really no hope, whether it's humanitarian disasters, whether it's conflict and all the rest. And the good that the UN does definitely outweighs the problems that are created by its failure to take global governance to the next stages, if you like. but then there must be something that takes it to the next stage. I'll be honest, if we didn't have the United Nations, as they always say, we would have to invent it. But what is the reinvention of the United Nations going to be? Is it going to be, in a sense, a reformed version of what we're seeing? So if we see 5 permanent members of the Security Council, will we see a few more? Will the veto be changed in any way, or will it stay and give the new members no veto? Is it going to be like the ship of Theseus, if you like, that you'll take away every part of the United Nations, bring it back together in some other form, and then say, this is the new UN? I think we're a little early in the game to really be talking about what exactly will replace it. But I do think what we can talk about is a few things. You know, I can speak as an Indian, not necessarily as part of as the Indian government or the Indian state response, but I do think we are at a point today where the world is looking at these 2 major powers and saying, what about the rest of us? And the UN therefore has to represent that.
I know you said it's a bit too early to talk about sort of how a new system, how a new United Nations or system of global governance could look. Let's do it anyway. We're all about, you know, the early parts in this series. And you mentioned that you can speak sort of maybe from an Indian perspective, which I think would be very interesting, because India is not only a major and quickly rising power in the world, it was also a key player during the Cold War in the so-called non-alignment movement. And so this idea, kind of this foreign policy idea of non-dependence, of not being in a camp or on one side, it seems to me still carries some weight today. So from, you know, to the extent that you can assess this from an Indian perspective today, what system of global governance would India like to see, and what could and should India do to help bring this about?
Well, certainly, and you mentioned non-alignment, and it's necessary to separate the two. The non-alignment from the fate of the non-aligned movement, which had more than, I think, 120 members, but eventually was not able to emerge as a great, as a great force in the world in the current scenario. Even so, like the UN, if you didn't invent it, you are going to need something that holds the middle. You cannot have, 2 polar extremes and then either countries that are on either side of that divide, because there is this entire body in the middle that needs representation, that needs a chance to also be an important part of the global governance structure. So there is a move even within India to the Alliance for Multilateralism, for example, multipolarity, issue-based alliances. I remember years ago, someone speaking about the rule of 50-50-50, that the world's global governance would no longer be, I'm on this side or I'm on that side, but on 50 different issues, there would be 50 different coalitions taking 50 different positions, so that you didn't necessarily align yourself to any one of those coalitions. I don't know if that is workable. We've also got smaller coalitions that India is a part of, the Indo-Pacific Coalition, for example, to keep maritime freedoms in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. You have the SCO and BRICS, the Emerging Economies Coalition that India is a part of. But I think increasingly, and here I speak completely on my own as an Indian who's also grown up in the idea of a South Asian reality, that increasingly I think we are going to have to look at regional networks and regional formations as a possible building block of the next world order or the next United Nations.
So what you're saying, this I think is a very interesting point that you've just made here at the end, is that instead of going out and acknowledging that this UN system needs reform and just trying to rebuild it somehow globally, which might be very difficult because the whole issue is that countries seem to be less willing to agree on something. So how would they be able to agree on sort of a new system? So what you're saying instead, let's sort of like build it back from the bottom and start having all these regional solutions and mechanisms. And I do want to talk about this a little bit more. So you've mentioned some of these, but these are wildly different organizations. So the Indo-Pacific is not even an organization, it's more of an idea. The SCO has a fairly limited focus. BRICS is again kind of like a different coalition. So it seems to me, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that these are nice like talking clubs, but they're not really effective in governing anything, are they? And if they're not, what would they have to do to become more powerful?
Absolutely. And Nico, since each of these coalitions exist and seems to feed into, if you like, the world structure, let me put my thesis out there, that actually we could bet on something that we have all been a part of and realized the importance of, and that is regional structures as well. And when I said building blocks, it is because if the United Nations of 1945 essentially went from top down, the victors of the World War was the criterion. They didn't have another criterion at the time. Today, in the post-coronavirus pandemic world, where there is this entire worry about globalization and how it destroyed not only the supply chains, or it actually enhanced the spread of this pandemic. Let's move away from that, but not move to an individualistic, each one of the 192 countries for themselves kind of model, to something somewhere in the middle, which is regional structures. We've all seen these regional structures built in the last century on trade and economy. So you have the European Union, you have the ASEAN, you have Mercosur in South America, you have the African nations, and they now have a free trade agreement as well. You have the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, which has been floundering, but SARC is a viable unit. You have the Eurasian Economic Unit. You have the CAEC, Central Asian Economic Cooperation Unit. So these units have been built in a more organic way, if you like, than the top-down model. And my thesis would be that we need to push for regionalization. It's somewhere between globalization and complete localization, which is a protectionist instinct, which I think the world is a little wary of. And I'll quickly put where it has an edge, because I know you're running out of time, Nico. But I think just in terms of economy and trade, we will no longer be wasting as much time traveling across the world, selling ketchup from one part of the world to another part of the world. There'll be a greater emphasis on producing what you can consume within a region. You have geographical challenges that are in common, the cultural edge in common, pandemics that spread in the area can be isolated, and conflicts between nations can be dealt with much easier within a regional context. Why am I saying this? Because if this becomes the building block of the next world order, if the new United Nations, if that's what we still want to call it, is something made up of regional blocks, then I think we have a greater chance of representation for all. I mean, I'd like to say at the end that, the new equitable formula for the United Nations must actually build on these, because it is the way of all democracies. And that's what we want to move towards.
And I think this is very beautifully put, as you just did, that there's kind of like a middle ground between one global solution, which we seem to be unable to produce right now, and just kind of like each country for itself, individualistic populism, and this is regionalization. I think the beauty of the system that you described is also that, of course, it's kind of this, it's a version of non-alignment, because you can be part of different and ever-changing coalitions at the same time. So you can sort of like, can basically like build your own menu of regional organizations that you want to be a part of as an organization. So I do think it has a lot going for it. It's convincing. One last question that I have for it though, before we end this. So if we imagine a world where all these regional organizations, and perhaps many more than we have today, exist, but we've kind of done away with the top. So there's no UN, or it doesn't really matter anymore, and there's none of the UN sort of associated global organizations anymore. How would this sort of complex, interdependent web of regional organizations be able to deal with global issues like climate change, or even more relevant maybe right now, a pandemic? So isn't sort of the whole idea of this global system is that we're going to have more global problems in the future? And then how would this work, in an organization where like 17 different regional organizations would have to come up with a strategy?
Well, I think you can't look further than the coronavirus pandemic and how people reacted to it to start with. And how, because the reaction to that pandemic has told us something about our own nature. That the first reaction has been to close up, to go inwards, to try and fix the problem inwards, and then to slowly open up in our regions and try to create these bubbles, if you like, that are isolated and work better than try to open up to the whole world. The whole world is today in those situations. And my sense would be that these bubbles are actually these organic building blocks for the next global governance model that I think is going to come when we actually announce the end of the United Nations as we know it today.
Wow. Thank you so much, Suhasini Haidar, for being with us here today. This was excellent and insightful, and I could continue talking to you about the regionalization for a long time. I do think that's a fantastic and thought-provoking idea. We're going to end this conversation here for the moment. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for dialing in. The next and also final episode of this first season of The End of the Beginning is going to take place 1 week from now on Thursday, August the 13th. We'll have Bruno Massage, former Europe Minister of Portugal, who will join us to talk about the end of the Enlightenment. And I can already tell you that if you enjoyed today's conversation with Suhasini, you're going to enjoy the one with Bruno as well. I think there are some similarities to their views and approaches, so this should be interesting as well. Thank you again for having been here. And if you sign up for the Q&A, I'll see you over there in just a minute. And not, I look forward to welcome you soon at a virtual or perhaps even live event of Asia Society somewhere. Thank you very much.